death. Gramsci's violence is predicated on the necessities of political economy, the extraction of surplus labor, and the accumulation of capital. The violence of the slave relation is predicated more profoundly on the necessities of libidinal economy. At stake here is not the material health of an economic system. What is at stake here is the psychic health of the human race. The human being attains a kind of integrity of self-knowledge through his or her capacity to distinguish himself or herself from blacks. And this first element of Patterson's slavery, this gratuitous violence, is one of the key ways in which Patterson's definition, in which one can know oneself as a human being, as a member of the master class. I'm human because I'm not black. I know that I'm not black because my relationship to violence is logical and contingent. Violence invades my life when the equilibrium of hegemony has been breached. This is a profoundly different scenario to that of the slave, the black. The most ridiculous, as I said before, but understandable question that black person can ask oneself is, why did the pigs shoot me? Why was I lynched? Why am I incarcerated? Why Eleanor Bumpers? Why Amadou Diallo? Why Trayvon Martin? And so on. Why the deluge of spectacular death and mutilation of black bodies on screen, for which there is no cinematic mourning? The answer is that were it not for these repetitive spectacles of gratuitous violence, the human race would not be able to distinguish where it ended and where the black began. To drive this point home, Patterson writes, quote, "It is necessary to continually repeat the original violent act of transforming a free person into a slave. This act of violence constitutes the prehistory of stratified societies." Okay, so he's saying this act of violence constitutes the prehistory of stratified societies, such as capitalism. So what he is acknowledging is that it takes a massive formulation of violence to make a working class, as well as a slave. In other words, violence is essential to the prehistory of capitalist society, as well as to the prehistory of the slave estate. But, he continues, violence constitutes both the prehistory and the concurrent history of slavery, end quote. Violence may have constituted the prehistory of the capitalist worker relation, but it does not constitute the concurrent history of the capitalist, violence may have constituted the prehistory of the capitalist worker relation, but it does not constitute the concurrent history of that relation. The concurrent history of that relation is constituted by the push-pull between consent and force, by the always already possibility of equilibrium vouchsafed by hegemony. If Antonio Gramsci's worker is a threat to the integrity of capitalist political economy, the slave, the black, is a threat to the integrity of the world. What kind of world is it that can only maintain its coherence, its psychic integrity, through the renewal of strategies of violence against a black person? The second element is natal alienation. And here, Patterson writes, we move into the cultural aspect of the relation, to that aspect in which it rests on authority, on the control of symbolic instruments. The definition of the slave, however recruited, is a socially dead person, alienated from all rights or claims of birth. He or she ceased to belong to his or her own right to any legitimate social order, Patterson writes. Now this is very different from the Marxist worker who is not alienated from claims of birth, but who is alienated from his or her labor power. Natal alienation goes directly to the heart of what is critical in the slave's forced alienation, the loss of ties of birth in both ascending and descending generations. It was this alienation of the slave, Patterson continues, from all formal, legally enforceable ties of blood, and from any attachment to groups or localities other than those chosen for him or her by the master, that gave the relation of slavery its peculiar value to the master. The slave was the ultimate tool, as imprintable and as disposable as the master wished. To recap, gratuitous violence and natal alienation are Patterson's first two constituent elements of slavery. Patterson's third element of slavery is general dishonor. Slaves are always dishonored in a generalized way. The slave could have no honor because of the origin of his or her status, the indignity and all-pervasiveness of his or her indebtedness, his or her absence, and this is important, absence of any independent social existence, but most of all because he or she was without power except through another. End quote. Finally, Patterson summarized slavery as the permanent, violent domination of natally alienated and generally dishonored persons. And this is a perfect description of the way the ontological paradigm of black life differs from the ontological paradigm of the life of the worker. Again, the main point of departure I'm making here is violence. For the slave, for the black, there's never the possibility of living either in the capitalist class's hegemonic equilibrium between force and consent, nor can freedom be attained through a counter-hegemonic struggle to crush the capitalist state and create an ethical state. At every scale of abstraction, violence saturates black life. To put it differently, for black people, there is no time and space of consent, no time and space of consent, no relative respite from force and coercion. Violence spreads its tendrils across the body, chokes the community, and expands, intensifies, and mutates into new and ever more grotesque forms in the libidinal economy, in literature, and in the movies, to name two examples. So I'd like to close with this poem that points aesthetically to the analytic problems that I've raised with respect to thinking violence and blackness together. It's called Law Abiding. And I knew it was an ironic title, and I was not really terribly happy with it because I think that oftentimes irony is the last refuge of the weak, but there it is. Don't slant the story to fit your needs. Bullets been catching hell from niggers long as I've been born. Black apples, okay, you got your few bad bullets, but most work hard and vote. Yes, they vote, and got wives and sweet kids in the clip. Who cradles them when the nigger vamps? Who says what to them? Mrs. Bullet, I have some bad news for you. Then what? It's about your husband, Mr. John Frederick Bullet, or may I call you Frida? Frida John Frederick passed this evening. Now Frida, be strong, for unsavory are the details. He died in a nigger's spine. Crushed on impact. Now Frida, don't cry. The DA's on it. The judge has been briefed. And your husband's friends are in the streets. Thank you. Well, we ran out of seats, huh? Okay, it's your turn. As I tell my class, I get to sit and cut my paycheck. I'm glad you think it's funny. They don't. I guess, where's Ben? We have that. We still got time for questions. Is that right?
Yeah, we have like 50 minutes.
Okay. So comments? Whatever. Oh, yes.
Nothing especially profound, but it just always occurs to me that everything that you were saying is on the books as laws that were written consciously, thoughtfully, and put into law in this country. So if there's any confusion about what our status is in this country, when the Constitution was being written, black people were considered 3/5 of a person, and people's, that was for taxes. No, it wasn't.
Right.
And we still are.
Exactly.
During slavery, the fugitive slaves law said that a black man has no rights that a white man is bound to honor. We don't.
Yes. Yes.
Gathering of more than 3 black people is against the law.
Exactly.
It still is.
Yeah.
I mean, it's in our laws. We should not be confused. What you're saying is very thoughtful. It's just wonderful for me to hear you lay it out like this, because we seem to be so confused. And the way you're laying it out, it kind of takes away some of the confusion about what's going on around us.
Thank
in
you.
my mind.
And your historical remembrance helps as well. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like it's written in the law.
It is.
It's in our laws.
It is. It is.
And somebody actually thought about that when they wrote it. It wasn't just.
Yeah. As you know, and perhaps other people know, that every year I get younger and younger students who don't know. And the Herculean jurisprudential corrective of the Dred Scott decision actually traded on that. In fact, to support what you're saying, when the Supreme Court returned Dred Scott to slavery, many people thought that the Supreme Court was siding with one of the lower courts. So one lower court said he was free because he got to Minnesota, and Minnesota's a free territory. Another court said he was not free, he returned to slavery because the master had not granted him freedom. But the Supreme Court returned him to slavery, as I'm sure you know and other people know. But they corrected the logic. They said that we're not actually siding with the lower court at the level of contract. The lower court made the right decision to return him to slavery for the wrong reason. We're returning him to slavery because he's black, and as a black person, he has no subjective standing. So it was wrong to hear the case to begin with. And they proved their point by drawing a distinction between degraded human community, which would be Native Americans, and the absence of human community, which was Africa. And so it was a pedagogic decision meant to be an act of law, but also to educate the lower courts as to, since Africa is a place of no communal standing, then he can't be a subject of jurisprudence, and the case should not have been heard to begin with. Exactly. Yes.
Similar to Celia,
Yes.
slave that
Tell us about that.
Hartman talks about an enslaved woman who had been raped repeatedly since the day she was purchased in Missouri. And she one night took I think a wood log, and when the enslaver was coming to rape her, she beat him to death, and then attempted to burn his body and conceal the evidence of whatever, because she knew she was going to die for this. Somehow a case was brought to determine, I think, whether or not this was justifiable as a defense against rape, and the court, I think the case isn't even considered really case law, or in terms of setting precedent or anything. Like somebody had to find it in the basement of a Missouri County courthouse, because the ruling was that there was no such thing under law as the rape of an African enslaved woman.
Exactly.
That it simply did not exist at the crime.
Yeah, because rape trades on the absence of on the refusal of consent, and what they're saying is that the black woman she embodied the absence of consent, so she had no consent to refuse, and this is precisely, thank you for that, because it's at the heart of why hegemony doesn't work as a conceptual framework for thinking black oppression. Yeah.
And the ground of attempting to claim subjectivity is ontologically different for non-black women.
Exactly.
Than it is for black women.
Yeah. Thank you for that. In the back, yes.
So the point that you were making about beloved and the Toni Morrison quote, and death as a sanctuary from slavery, I'm wondering if you could connect that to what you were saying about how the Marxist, post-colonial theories lead us to a place where we see inclusivity, access to the political sphere, etc., as sanctuaries and refuge from the violence that those subjects experience. Like, what is the I guess role of survival in not just being an accommodation and then I mean,
I kind of got you up to the last part, so maybe I'll deal with the first part. I don't, unless you want to say a bit more when you say it, just spin it a little differently,
so
just so I can grasp it.
with the demands for inclusivity or increased access to the political sphere functioning as inadequate remedies, maybe, to the condition of gratuitous violence.
Okay, got it.
The black positionality
Yeah.
space work. What is the role then? Is anyone that calls for those things working in service of civil society? Is there any revolutionary demand for survival within a plantation? And if not, then is Sefe's killing of her daughter like the response?
Yeah, okay. So, part of the problem with my answering the question is that I raised the anecdote to heighten the problem, not to actually suggest how the problem might be resolved. And I think this is the difficulty that politicos and theorists often have with Afro-pessimism, because it offers an analysis of black suffering as slave suffering, but it doesn't actually, in most, there's a rhetorical structure to most political discourse. It's very simple, right? It's a description of the problem and then a prescription of what redress would be. And so in my work and in the work of most Afro-pessimists, the latter rhetorical gesture doesn't exist. And I think, so I don't actually have anything to say about that. I have an analysis that I'm working through with other people, and then hopefully that analysis will, connect with other people like me and black people on the ground, and it will be taken up. But I don't think that it will be taken up politically and in insurgent ways. But I'm not prepared to actually say what that looks like. I think once you start to say what that looks like, then you're talking about an oppressed position that is something other than black. And that's where the anxiety comes in with actually thinking black oppression, is that the, if you like, the Arnoldian or Anglo-American imprint on political theory imposes these two interlocking registers of analysis, description, and prescription. And I'm saying that that puts the brakes on thinking black suffering. So by putting the brakes on it, it means that in order to get there, then you have to ratchet down the scale of abstraction of gratuitous violence. You have to take away some aspect of black suffering and then analogize it with other sufferings, and which is precisely the work that I talk about in my second book, that white feminism and Marxism does, which is another form of accumulation and making fungible of the black body. So I think the answer is in the expansion of the analysis, not in the proposal of a remedy. And I might expand the analysis by saying, oh, yes, go ahead.
I mean, sorry to interrupt you, but sometimes there's a tendency to have a knee-jerk reaction and say, well, what do we do about it, because people don't want to fully conceptualize what is actually happening.
I think so, yeah. Thank you. I was going to speak for 5 minutes. It's my job to talk about. You know what I'm saying? I get paid to fill it out. Okay. Yes.
What were you going portion of the analysis, guys?
Can you hold on for 1 second? Let me say it like this. There's something that goes on in political theory that I think is problematic to thinking black suffering, and this is building on what Hannibal is saying, and it's a kind of, sometimes I think it's a kind of anxiety, all right? But if I'm going to be generous and say that, okay, I'm going to treat it as an academic and not just say it's anxious knee-jerk response, which I often think it is, then I would say it goes like this. As a rhetorician of power, I think that political theory is founded on a kind of generic narrative arc. And the arc it has kind of three movements from, just like the arc of any story, from equilibrium to disequilibrium to equilibrium restored or reorganized or reimagined. And so immediately, whether you're talking about whether you're talking, so I said Silverman in her book, Male Significant at the Margins, is saying, hey, look, people, there's a fundamental difference between my feminist theorizing and the theorizing of a Marxist like Antonio Gramsci. And the difference has to do with what I say is fundamental to the world being out of joint, and what Gramsci says is fundamental to the world being out of joint. He says the world is out of joint because of the difference between the antagonism between workers and bosses. I say the world is out of joint because of the antagonism between men and women, and that all women are the most oppressed group of people on the planet. And from that inaugural difference flowers out modes of capitalist domination, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, I'm oversimplifying, but we don't have 3 hours to know this. Okay. Now, my point is that where are they both alike, and where does that not serve us in thinking black suffering? They're both alike in that their theorization depends upon a narrative arc, which is to say the trajectory from something that was there, a prior plenitude, to its loss. The loss would be a kind of symbolic castration along the lines of positive Oedipus, which does not allow for psychic cathexis in the mother, but maintains or demands a psychic cathexis in the father, and that needs to be broken up. So the idea of man-woman and gender relations can be broken up. We destroy the nuclear family and have a new kind of set of family relations. Gramsci would say, no, it's the arc from the prior plenitude equilibrium of a group of people who were not pressed into service to capitalist production, and then disequilibrium is the capitalist state, and equilibrium restored or reorganized is the dictatorship of the proletariat. The problem here, so they can fight it out themselves, white people to white people, let them work that out. What I'm saying is that at the level of meta-commentary, they both assume temporality. And social death is the absence of a temporal progression. You would have to say that there was a point in time in the lives of not the lives of individual black people, but in the lives of blackness, in which the disequilibrium of gratuitous violence didn't exist. And this is a very controversial point. Not everyone in black studies agrees with me. But I'm suggesting that to quote Spillers, there's a flattening out, so that you can't even, narratology as a mode of understanding stories falls apart when thinking black non-existence. There is no prior plenitude of a place and time when violence was contingent. What you have is disequilibrium, birth, and elaboration by this violence that is pre-logical, faux equilibrium, which is to say affirmative action, civil rights, or police watch committees, and then we return to disequilibrium. There was never actually equilibrium in the place. There's never a narrative progression, and so temporality has been taken out, which is precisely why you can't actually draw, the conceptual frameworks cannot be reconciled, because you would have to actually talk about the violence of black people as having been contingent and sensible at some place in some point in time, and I don't think that's the case. There's, I don't know if there's someone in the back. Yes. Go ahead. Yeah. You.
So I was curious if you had any thoughts about political ideas like communization, which also reject that narrative structure and refuse prescriptive and positive descriptions of a post-revolutionary anything, like Tikkun or Theory Communiste or...
You mean Tikkun, the magazine? Or?
No.
Okay, then I'm not familiar.
Okay. Maybe something to check out. Or how about like Giorgio Agamben and the idea of homo soccer and...
Yeah, well, you see, here, Agamben's problem is not that he's wrong, and I say this in my second book, is that he's late. The Jewish Muslim is not the first instantiation of ontological absence. And so he's using he's theorizing the Muslim through the camps, and what I'm saying is that in his theorization of the Muslim and it's been a while since I wrote this, but for $27 you can buy my book because actually I can't remember exactly I can't remember all the points that I make about this, but I can say in general he's confusing genocide and the kind of evacuation of Jewish subjectivity in his theorization of the Muslim. He's confusing that, which is correct in his report, but he's thinking of it ontologically when I'm suggesting it's an experience in the historical trajectory of Jewish people. Okay, so you can't make an analogy there with blacks because the production of a non-being who is sentient is not, for me, a kind of point on a chronology of black existence. It is actually imbricated in what it means to be black ontologically. It's not historical, it's metaphysical.
Isn't his arguments in homo soccer don't rely on that historical example? I mean, he starts with Aristotle and there's certainly a history within how he does, and he makes note of change over time, but it seems like he takes the camp as being paradigmatic, but not, it doesn't rely on that being a fact of Jewish history.
Okay, we have a different reading. But I'm at a disadvantage because it's been a while since I
You
actually.
said that's addressed in your book.
Yeah, red, white, and black.
Oh.
Yeah, and I can't remember everything I. But we'll exchange cards, and you can I can answer you over email when I go back and reread what I wrote and reread Agamben as well. Yes, 1, 2.
So I wanted to preface this and say that there's an implicit critique here, but this question is a sincere question. I wanted to ask about the temporalities of Afro-pessimism. So your work and the work of others in the Afro-pessimist camp has been taken up by a younger generation of sort of black, queer, sort of self-styled radicals, but who sort of look out at sort of the moment that you narrate about your parents and the black big bourgeoisie realizing that things are not how they would have imagined. So I wonder I wonder about Afro-pessimism, the rise of sort of Afro-pessimism, what it sort of tells us about sort of the world that we look out at now. And if you've had any thoughts about the way that your work has been taken up by a really sort of recent younger generation.
I'm excited about it. I don't, I think that the best, I can't give you an adequate answer to that because I think that the best Afro-pessimist theorization, to meet you where you are is yet to come. And it's happening with Black people in universities. It's also happening with the economic, I always get this wrong, freedom fighters in South Africa. Oh my goodness. My comrade here, and so there's a kind of limit to my work that is actually being expanded upon, and I'm not entirely sure. I'm excited about it. I'm energized by it, and I'm really excited about it in places like Oakland and Johannesburg and Cape Town, where people are trying, and New York City, where people are trying to think through how does this actually work or not work day to day on the ground in terms of political struggle. I started off with these kind of large cognitive interrogation of large mapping strategies. So I don't know, maybe you could ask me in a different way and I could actually address what you're saying, but I'm not sure that I can at this moment.
Well, I think, so the reason I prefaced it with sort of this notion of the critique is
Yeah.
because that's been sort of one of the critiques marshaled at Afro-pessimism, that the only reason it sort of rises now is in this sort of post-70s, post-radical, post the failings of the anti-colonial movements, that this is why you get sort of this narrative that has kind of this
I
right?
see
And so
what
I
you're
wanted
saying.
to ask it from a more like positive vein.
Yes.
Which is the way that it's been sort of
Okay.
taken up in this moment, but I
Okay.
don't want to sort of fall into sort of that critique of, well, people
Yeah.
are just sad that things didn't work out in
Yeah.
the 60s, right?
Well, yeah, I hear you. I don't think Afro-pessimism is new. I mean, I think that you can see it in the, what I think has happened is that it's gotten a moniker, and the aspects of it which speak to how Black non-existence cannot be reconciled with others' existence has been thrown into relief. So, but I think it's just been there since the Arab slave trade of 625. I mean, I think that for 625 moving on to the year 1000 and beyond, that Black people have known that the conceptualization of other people, in other words, the broad meta strategies through which Arab filiation becomes coherent, that you can't have Arab filiation without the destruction of African families, that those two things are inextricably bound, which is to say that the capacity for Arabs to have families is totally dependent upon the destruction of Black people? No. But it's to say, so it's not the totality of that paradigm, but it's to say that I believe that as you move from 625 all the way through, by the time the Portuguese get here, and Black women are being raped and carried to the coast to serve as sexual concubines in the Arab Peninsula, and Black boys between the ages of 13 and 18 are being what's called leveled at the scrotum, which is to say all their genitals are torn away and the knife scrapes their pelvic bone. And then they are marched in hundreds of thousands from the interior to the eastern shores, and those who live cross the waters to become the kind of guardians of female locations in the Arab family. I think that people are theorizing Afro-pessimism at that moment, understanding that there is a necessary symbiosis between the destruction of Black filiation and the production of Arab filiation. What they're calling it, I don't know. There's this notion in the literature of Solomon Northup, who writes you know, the movie 12 Years a Slave says that, well, there's a rational reason for the beating of Patsy, and the memoir says, no, this is a bacchanal pleasure which sustains the psychic life of those who are not us. So I think that it's not new. It's in those moments of Fanon which he can look at the least. You know, those moments that he just, you know, because he says he's got this project of disalienating the black psyche, and all through the book are these problems which say, you know, I mean, it's way beyond psychoanalysis, you know. Yeah, get your mind clear on the couch, but don't go outside, you know. I think the only thing that Afro-pessimism is doing is looking at structural violence and subordinating the hope and optimism of all the other stuff that came with that vision forever, ever since we've been treated this way. I'm sorry, there was one thing.
I will just say that I agree with the long version of, I was just going to say, you know, this is, Afro-pessimism can be discerned in any reading that you, well, maybe any reading, but much of the readings in United States history, much less if you go out of this country and read in the Caribbean, and black people writing about their situations, it has always had an Afro-pessimism. It's just that now it has a name, like you said, and it's being analyzed and given definition more so than it once had been. But I know you're familiar with the codes.
Yes.
That was Afro-pessimism, and that was written many years ago. A lot of people dismissed it, but there was a lot of truth in that. It's black people being real.
Yeah, exactly. That's what it is. It's not new, it's just useful.
It's just that we are so confused right now, and we are being, it's an onslaught of confusion on the minds of black people and black children, that it's refreshing.
Yes, thank you.
A lot of people are identifying.
Yes. Okay, one here. I'm gonna look at the back so you tell. I'll keep going until you tell me we're done.
I think we still have to.
Or until I collapse. Go ahead.
20 more minutes, and then we'll is that okay?
Could you speak at all, how at all, if at all, you relate your theorization of Afro-pessimism to the kind of ideas of Afro-pessimism that were being created to talk about Africa in the 1980s?
Yeah, oh my goodness, how does, this is a problem. Afro-pessimism was already on the scene before. So the way Afro-pessimism came about is I was in the rhetoric department studying here, and shortly before I was to do my oral examinations to go ABD, Jared Sexton, who's the director of African American Studies at UC Irvine, my colleague and comrade, said he was looking at, because I came into the university having been one of these people who was purged from the ANC, and I was doing a PhD in comparative literature there, and the purge extended to my job and extended to my academic life, and the Mandela moderates didn't have anybody's back who was, you know, had political odds with them. So, but before that, I had been doing political education for the Workers' Library, various groups in the ANC, the Communist Party, and that political education was centered around the work of Antonio Negri and the work of Antonio Gramsci. And so I kind of came to the University of California in 1997, kind of, you know, this is what happens to people who've been bums all their lives at a very advanced age in my 40s. This is what you do when you don't know what to do with your life. You go back to school. You know, so, and I was just trying to work out a more robust theorization of the global schematization of Marxist theory. And I kept running up against these places in Capital and in Negri's work, and where I thought that what I was seeing with black people in South Africa and here really wasn't adequately accommodated by that theory. Okay, And so Sexton was, even though he was younger than me, he was about to graduate. He says, you should meet this woman in English named Sadia Hartman, because what you're saying sounds like stuff she's already written about, but you're trying to talk about it in the 20th century, and she's written about it in the 19th century. And so I went to meet her, and I was like, wow, you got to be on my committee, you know. And then I interviewed her for a journal called Keep How, which is from UC Berkeley. And in that interview, she came up with the phrase Afro-pessimism as we were talking about the novels. We were trying to compare the novels, the dystopic novels of West African post-colonial writers with the optimistic novels of South African writers in a moment of liberation, and say that they will have their dystopia soon, right? So we were thinking. She gave the phrase Afro-pessimist to talk about the ways in which she and I were having this conversation that we were taking that would later become this. The word Afro-pessimism that existed in the 1980s was elaborated by journalists and social scientists. Our Afro-pessimism is elaborated by revolutionary thinkers and people in the humanities. And their Afro-pessimist phrase was to say that, you know, Africans can't get their shit together, they can't govern properly, they're corrupt, and Africa will never be a place of modernization. It's like the two words actually are the same words, but they don't have any real relation to each other. I'm trying to think metacritically about modes of thought and violence, and they're thinking empirically and sociologically and in a right-wing reactionary way about the performance of African leaders, leaving out in their analysis the colonial past of people like themselves. So maybe one or two more, and then I can turn it to a pumpkin. Yeah.
Cool. Have you considered the works of Jean Baudrillard and Jeremy Fernando as if they were relevant pathways to explore, to analyze, or simply on which to meditate in conjunction with your scholarship, specifically about like trajectory and eventness?
I have not.
Oh. Fair.
But send me an email and I will.
I will.
Okay. Where's Ben? Okay, I think there's one more seated.
Okay, I guess I'll ask a question, and, you know, especially because it's Black History Month, and, you know, I think you've mentioned history a couple of times,
Yeah.
or the role of history, right? And, or, you know, like thinking about things as like in a historical way versus like thinking about history in context of the present. And so what do you think about that, given that it's like Black History Month, and whether or not that like functions as this like optimistic way of thinking about
I'm going to read the last few lines of my book here rather than try and actually build a answer from scratch. I think it's important to think about history, but history is founded upon historicity. And historicity assumes the type of narrative art that I spoke about. And so I think that if, rather than kind of inculcate history in a celebratory fashion, what Black History Month helps me do is to think about the problem, the dissonance between history and blackness, even though duration changes. So I'm not sure that I can. So I wrote this. It may sound a bit out of context, but it addresses what you were asking, if only obliquely. At the end, in the epilogue, I wrote, "It is customary for a book like this to end with a prescriptive gesture, at least the germ of a new beginning, if not a new world. A seed to be nurtured and cultivated by Vladimir Lenin's question, what is to be done? Even when such seeds are sown throughout a book, an author might be tempted to harvest a yield, however meager, in the conclusion. Not only have such seeds not been sown in my book, but I have argued that anti-blackness is the genome of this horticultural template for human renewal. Given the structural violence that it takes to produce and reproduce a slave, violence as the structure of black life as opposed to violence as one of many lived black experiences, a concluding consideration of Lenin's question would ring hollow. Frantz Fanon came closest to the only image of sowing and harvesting that befits this book. Quoting Aimé Césaire, he urged his readers to start, quote, the end of the world, the only thing worth the effort of starting. A shift from horticulture to pyrotechnics. Rather than mind the restoration and reorganization dreams which conclusions often fall prey to, however unwittingly, Fanon dreams of an undoing, however implausible, for its own sake. Still, there are moments when even Fanon finds his own flames to be too incendiary. So much so that he momentarily backs away from the comprehensive emancipation that he calls for, which is why one can find the Fanon of the slave on the same page as the Fanon of the post-colonial subject. Nonetheless, I am humbled by his efforts, and though I am freighted with enough hubris to extend his ensemble of questions beyond his unintentional containment strategies, I know better than to underrate their gravitas by offering, or even hinting at, a roadmap to freedom so extensive it would free us from the epistemic air we breathe. To say we must be free of air while admitting to knowing no other source of breath is what I have tried to do here. Thank you.